Thank you, Whip Scalise, Ranking Member Comer. As many of you know, I began investigating the origins of COVID-19 in April last year, both as a top Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee and as the chair of the China Task Force encompassing 11 committees of jurisdiction. We invited the Democrats to join us. Speaker Pelosi said it was a diversion. I released my initial report last September. In that report, we touched on the possibility that it could have come from the lab. After continuing to research this topic, I now feel comfortable concluding that it is more likely than not that it came from the lab. In fact, I would say there's credible evidence as a former federal prosecutor. Unfortunately, we may never know for certain because the Chinese Communist Party went to great lengths to cover up this outbreak. They detained the doctors in order to silence them. They disappeared journalists. They destroyed lab samples. They hid the fact that there was clear evidence of human-to-human transmission, and they refused to allow a real investigation into the origins. And at the same time, the WHO, under Director General Tedros, failed to warn the world of the impending pandemic. Instead, he parroted the CCP's talking points and was really acting as a puppet of General Secretary Xi. As I've often said, this was the worst cover-up in human history. Now, more than 1 year later, at least 4 million people have lost their lives, including more than 600,000 Americans. Unfortunately, the Biden administration is refusing to take investigating the origins of this virus seriously. They are pushing for yet another WHO investigation, even after the last one was so tainted by the CCP that even Tedros has said more investigations needed to be done. But that's why we're here today, because the president and congressional Democrats are forcing us to do this work alone. As we continue this investigation, I believe it's time to completely dismiss the wet market as a source of the outbreak. We have a confirmed case 10 days before the wet market cluster that had no connection to the market itself. In fact, I would say this is a diversion by the CCP, and all roads point to the lab. And even as the CCP now has admitted after the fact that they don't believe the virus originated at the wet market. But as a former federal prosecutor, I can tell you the preponderance of the evidence that it came from the lab is very convincing. State Department cables from 2018 detail significant concerns about the safety protocols not being followed at the new campus of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We know that this was not the first instance of safety protocols being ignored at the Chinese labs. In 2004, SARS leaked from a similar lab in Beijing. We now know that at the same time of the State Department cables, and for several years before, scientists at the WIV were conducting gain-of-function research at both the new and old facilities. This is genetic modification of the virus to make it more viral, to make it more transmittable, to make it more infectious in humans. Some of this research was conducted not only at BSL-4, but BSL-2 labs, even though that kind of research should be conducted at BSL-4. BSL-2 are far less secure. By the way, there's one very close to the wet market. In addition, in a city 5 times larger than the city of Houston, the first signs of the new illness were all clustered around the old WIV facility, the level 2 facility. Then on September 12th, 2019, the WIV suddenly took their virus database offline. You have to ask the question, why? Why did they take this offline? Removing the database would prevent hospitals in the city from comparing samples from sick patients to the lab's library of viruses. If the CCP was attempting to cover up a leak of coronaviruses being studied at the WIV, this would remove the ability to link COVID-19 back to the WIV. According to a Harvard study, in the following weeks, 5 of the 6 hospitals surrounding the old WIV saw the highest daily average of cars in their parking lot in 2.5 years. This indicates people around the old WIV facility were suddenly sicker than usual, and they were visiting hospitals at a higher rate than usual. If an outbreak had begun around September from a leak, this is exactly what we would see. And new testimony now received by my committee reveals the Chinese military potentially took over this lab not in January 2020 as reported, but earlier in 2019. The Chinese military were actually in the facility at the time of 2017. That signals to me, as a prosecutor, that the CCP was worried about something at the lab before the world even knew what COVID-19 was. Why else would they put the Chinese military in charge? In October 2019, Wuhan hosted the 2019 World Military Games. These are similar to the Olympics, but with military personnel competing. More than 9,300 athletes from over 100 countries came to the city. And it should have been a massive public relations opportunity for the CCP, yet no fans or observers were allowed to attend. There were reports of roads being blocked, with athletes describing Wuhan as a ghost town. If a virus had leaked from the lab in early September, and there was an uptick in hospital visits around the old WIV, the CCP would likely be worried. This would potentially lead them back and lock down the city and ban fans from the game, which is exactly what happened. Most telling of all, dozens of these athletes have recently come forward saying they got sick while at the games with what would now be classified as COVID-like symptoms. The village where the athletes lived was less than 8 miles from the old WIV and connected to downtown Wuhan by a new subway stop. I now believe this was actually one of the earliest COVID-19 super spreader events. At least 4 of these athletes were from countries who have now confirmed the virus was circulating within their borders in November and December of 2019. That would be Italy, Brazil, France, and Sweden. This would be the exact time frame that indicated entered their borders in late October, likely from the military game athletes. I've also discovered some very important new facts. They not only point to the Wuhan Institute being the likeliest point of origin, but they also establish a high likelihood that the virus was man-made as well. I believe we've found the answer to the question, quote, how did this virus from a cave 1,000 miles away get to the middle of a city of 11 million? It wasn't natural. It was a lab. Next month, the House Foreign Affairs Committee the Republicans will release an updated origins report that will detail all of our new findings. So with that, Whip Scalise and Ranking Member Comer, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.